What's up guys, welcome to this review of Star Wars Thrawn Ascendancy, The Lesser Evil, the third and final of this Thrawn Origin trilogy. What did I think of this? I think this is a decent book. I think it's a pretty good end to this trilogy, a trilogy that I haven't exactly loved. It pales in comparison to other Thrawn trilogies, for example, but I do think it does a pretty good job at wrapping up all the loose ends and all the threads that are coming into this trilogy and linking up to the prior canonical Thrawn books leading into Star Wars Rebels. I think that it does a good job of all of that. So, if you've read the prior Thrawn books, then I think this is of course a must-read because it is wrapping that up, it is connecting all the dots and linking up to the other Thrawn books. So I think it is a must-read in that regard. I do think the book's a little on the long side. I think it's the longest of Thrawn books so far. It's over 500 pages, I think. I was reading it on a Kindle. I don't really pay much attention to page counts, but it is a long book and I think it's too long. I think there's a lot in this book that could have been trimmed down or cut out entirely. There's a lot in this book that didn't need to be there. There's a lot of this book where characters are kind of just meandering, waiting for things to happen, or they're just kind of like waiting for things to be revealed to them that we, the audience, the readers, already know. So for example, early on in the book, something could be revealed to a certain character, and then later in that book, another character then has to go through a chapter where that thing is revealed to them. It would have been easier if that was condensed down, trimmed down a bit, for our sake, because we're getting the same information twice just from two different perspectives, and the two different perspectives aren't exactly eye-opening or unique or special in any way. But there's a lot of that stuff that's going on there, and a lot of that stuff could have been trimmed down, could have smoothed out and streamlined the book. There are some cool action scenes and action moments in here, as there always are. Timothy Zahn, the writer, who is a very good writer. The action scenes are very militaristic, very strategic focused, and that's the usual thing you would get from him. So you can expect a lot of talk about strategy and expect a lot of things where there's like a plan moving out that we, the audience, the readers, don't actually know about until it actually happens. So there's a lot of like big cool reveals and moments in the action scenes, particularly towards the end. There's a really cool moment towards the end where you know something's afoot but you don't know what, and then there's a huge dramatic moment. It's like, yeah, gotcha bitch. And then yeah, it's just a really cool moment like that, and it pays off really well. But the book has also got a lot of slower, more dramatic moments, particularly in the second half. The first half is kind of all about wrapping up the events of the prior book and then setting things in motion for what this book's going to be about. Then the second half is about wrapping everything up and bringing all the character arcs and story points to a close. And I do think it does a good job of that, but there's still just a lot of stuff there that doesn't quite need to be there. And a lot of the dramatic stuff, a lot of the big reveals and motion moments are really well executed. But in the prior Thrawn books, there's been this like political arc going on in the background with certain characters who do not like Thrawn, who have been plotting against Thrawn, and there's a lot of political stuff in this book about families, a lot of Game of Thrones style political stuff, and it was cool and interesting at first, but then it never really amounted to much. And in this book, it's very much in the background, yeah, but it's also a bit distracting. Every now and then you'll go back to these politicians and what they're doing and what they're saying, and again they are kind of just reacting to things that we've already seen and already know about, and it's always confusing trying to remember who these characters are, because one of the weaknesses of this book and of all the Thrawn books, I've got to say, is Timothy Zahn doesn't spend a lot of time differentiating the characters in terms of appearance and what they look like. So we know they're chiss, we know they're blue-skinned and got red eyes, but it's like, what makes this blue-skinned red-eyed person look different from this blue-skinned red-eyed person? Nothing really. It doesn't really go into saying like, right, this person's got a squeaky voice, this person's got a deep voice, or anything like that. So a lot of characters do blend together at a certain point. It's just their weird and confusing names that set them apart, and that's really disappointing and frustrating. Trying to remember, because sometimes you could be like several chapters between seeing certain characters. But the key characters do stand out a little bit more, like Thrawn and Valius and Sherry, for example. They all do have unique personalities and appearances. But Timothy Zahn is in no way focused on trying to remind you what each of these characters looks like. So you are reliant on descriptions and explanations from the prior books. So it's important that you remember these characters from the prior books, otherwise this book isn't going to serve as a reminder. The political stuff though, getting back to that, a lot of that stuff is about reminding you about what's going on in the background, about what's going on in the story. And that's kind of all that serves to be in this book. It's a bit disappointing that it's not more crucial and more important. At least you do see the payoffs for a lot of it towards the back end of the book, because they've been building to that. But at least they've been building to that in prior books, not so much this one. And yeah, it just feels like they put that in there because it had to be there, rather than because they needed. They put that in there because it had to be a part of this book to some extent. But then they've tried to expand on it with having all these reactions to things and predicting certain things that are going on, and yeah, it just doesn't always work, and it's not always interest. So there's a lot of teasing going on in this book. A lot of stuff about the Grisks. They keep saying the Grisks are a threat. The Grisks are going to be a threat. And it's all about Jixtus. Jixtus being the main villain across this Thrawn trilogy. He is the main threat here, and they deal with Jixtus in this book to a certain extent, not going into spoilers. So, but they're also teasing things out that we know cannot be solved at the end of this trilogy. And we know by the next books that have already been released, because they've released them out of order, that they're still not solved. And we know from Star Wars Rebels, because of what happens to Thrawn, they're still not solved. So when's this whole thing with the Grisks that they're building up upon actually going to be dealt with? Is this actually going to be in a TV show? Because we know Thrawn is being teased for the TV show universe now. Or is this going to be strictly in the books? And in which case, if it's in the books, how important is it going to actually be to Star Wars? Because it feels like it's going to be very important. But is it going to be very important to the larger Star Wars universe, or is it just important to this part of the Star Wars universe? So that's a little annoying that I don't really know at this point. And I'm a little concerned that I spent all this time reading these books for something that's not going to be that important or crucial. So yeah, I'm a little concerned that that's what's going to happen. But it remains to be seen. Maybe I'll be surprised by that. Maybe the Grisks will be a big threat. Maybe that's something that they're going to deal with in the TV show moving forward. Who knows? So in a lot of these Thrawn books, there's a main narrative going on featuring all the characters, and then there's a flashback story going on, which then ties into the main narrative somehow. The last flashback story was about characters coming in and from an alien race and getting to know the Chiss and so on, and it felt very distracting. It didn't always feel like it was important or interesting, and there was some interesting stuff going on there, but it just felt like it was just too big a part of that book. This one though fares much better. This one actually does focus on Thrawn and her relationship with another Chiss, and it's much more pared down, much more focused, much more engaging. It feels much more relevant, and it actually expands on Thrawn's origins, because it is like the very first thing Thrawn did as he joined the family, and showing his military past and history and so on, and how he got to where he is in the Thrawn Ascendancy. So the flashback story feels much more important, much more relevant, much more engaging, and it's much shorter as well. You'll be lucky if you get like 5 or 6 flashback chapters in the whole book, and they always come at a moment which feels like, right, it's time for a little break, it's time to get a little like side story now. It never feels like it's being shoehorned in, it never feels like it's pulling you away from the main action. So it's really well paced out as well, and I like that. The flashback story really works well here. So, talking about the characters a little bit more, not a lot to say here. It's a third in the trilogy, you know, the same characters are in here. They're not introducing many, in fact I don't think they introduced any new characters beyond like one new villain, really. And maybe a couple of side minor characters. I do like the villains in this book though, so I'll talk about them first because I brought them up. So the Nicardoon are the new villains, the new alien race being used by Jixtus. They are given a unique look and personality. They're all about enlightening people. So yeah, they've got their own motivations and goals, and their relationship with Jixtus is interesting because Thrawn is constantly teasing out that actually it might not be what you think it is, it might not seem like it is, and that's cool and interesting. It doesn't quite pay off in a good way, I have to admit, but it's good. I like these villains. There's a bit more to them than the prior villains, like Yiv, for example, where they are just villainous. This time they do dive into them a little bit more. What the whole enlightenment thing means is a little vague. They don't go into too much detail about them. You don't actually see things from the perspective of the villains too much in this book, and that's a bit disappointing. all you get to see is the villains looking at things and reacting to things, rather than actually diving into them, saying, right, this is where they're from, this is their backstory, this is their history, and so on. So yeah, a little disappointing in that regard. They could have done with a bit more fleshing out, but yeah, much more interesting than prior villains in the Thrawn book. But the main characters, Thalius, Thrawn, Samacro, Sherry, they're all standouts, they're all well developed, they're all likable. I like the stuff about them. You get a lot more of Samacro in this book, which I like. He's a really interesting character because he was the captain of the ship until Thrawn came along. Now he's beneath Thrawn, and he's always had a bit of an issue with that. And he's always got suspicions about Thalius being part of this crew because he thinks she's a spy. All of this stuff works well. Their storylines come together really well, and I think they end on a really cool, interesting stuff as well, and that they start to trust each other, they start to like each other, or do they, kind of thing. And yeah, I like where their stories go. They are the much more interesting characters, but I've always liked Thalius. I think she's a fascinating character. Her stuff doesn't become quite so important until the second half of the book, and in the second book in the series, it didn't feel like she was that important at all. So yeah, Sherry, they finally reveal why she's so significant, why she's so important, but again, it feels like she's much more of a plot device than a character in this book, which is a bit disappointing. But yeah, I like how they get closure, and if we never see those characters again, I'll be like, yeah, I'm happy with that. They have a full story arc now. Really cool. The side characters and supporting characters though, not so much. A lot of the side characters and not supporting characters are there because they have to do or say something to progress the story in a certain way. They're not much more than just plot points, they're not much more than story elements, and that's a bit disappointing, but hey, it's to be expected. There's a lot of characters in this book, with a lot of confusing, familiar names, and again, not a lot of description into what they look like or what differentiates them from other people. So beyond the main cast of characters, the characters themselves are pretty disappointing. Just a few miscellaneous points. I've already said the book's a bit too long, I thought. The action scenes, Timothy Zahn's always going into like strategic elements and focusing much more on like maneuvers and strategy rather than explosions and action, and I think that's cool and that it makes it very dramatic and exciting, but at the same time it's sometimes hard to figure out what exactly is going on. It's hard to visualize it sometimes because he is a very smart guy, it seems. He's using certain words and phrases which are very militaristic, and if you don't know what these certain words and phrases are or what they mean, then it can be hard to understand exactly what's going on. So yeah, luckily I do read it on a Kindle, so I can just highlight the word and look it up and so on, so that works well for me. But yeah, other readers might struggle with the action scenes at times. And final thing I'm going to say is that this book is, while it is longer than the prior books, and while it's too long, I do think it's less repetitious than the prior books, in that a lot of the issues I had with the prior books is like, it's constantly saying Thrawn, not very good at politics, Thrawn, not very good at social stuff, constantly just pointing that stuff out as a reminder, say, hey, Thrawn has his weaknesses. This book doesn't really do that. It doesn't constantly remind you of that things, even though those things are still important, they are still relevant. So I think he does balance that out a lot better this time, so good on him, he finally figured that out. And that's my review of Star Wars, Thrawn Ascendancy, The Lesser Evil. The final in this trilogy. I think it's a good way to wrap up this trilogy, and overall this trilogy, a pretty decent origin story for Thrawn in the new canon. I liked it, let's say, but I do have my issues with it. Do I recommend it? Yes, but you do have to read the prior books. Even the ones that were set afterwards, I think you have to read before this one. You can't just read this as a standalone whatsoever, otherwise nothing will make sense. So that's a bit of a weakness to it, but it's to be expected when it's in a trilogy. So hey, what are you reading this one for if you haven't read the others anyway? So yeah, go read this if you're a Star Wars fan, go read this if you're a Thrawn fan. Until next time though, why not subscribe to my channel to get more content like this, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at @the_GrantBurton for all my thoughts and opinions up to date as I get them. And is that the end of the show? Yes, that is the end of the show. Thank you for watching.